The shawl was folded so perfectly it looked like a prayer. Della Winslow stood at the fence post at the edge of her property, her breath caught somewhere between her ribs and her throat, staring at the cream-colored wool that had no business being this clean, this neat, this impossibly folded when she had left it tangled and tear-soaked on the weathered post 3 days ago. She had been sure the wind would take it. She had half hoped the wind would take it, because then she would not have to remember that she had stood here in the dark and sobbed until her legs gave out, pressed her face into the wool and cried for everything she had lost, everything she feared, everything she could not say to a single living soul in Creston Falls, Colorado. And now it was back, washed, folded, placed on the fence post with a care so deliberate it made her chest ache in a brand new way. She touched the edge of the fabric with 2 fingers. It smelled like creek water and pine soap, nothing like the lavender she used in her own washing, nothing like the cedar trunk where it had lived before her husband Roy Winslow had died and left her alone in a territory that did not care whether a widow survived her first winter or not. Someone had found it. Someone had taken it, washed it with their own hands and brought it back, and not just tossed it over the fence like a man flinging a rag. This had been done with intention. Her eyes went up to the tree line without her permission, to the dark wall of pines that climbed the mountain behind her homestead, and something cold walked down the back of her neck. Because the only person who lived up that mountain was Monroe Walden, and Monroe Walden was not the kind of man you thought about with warmth. He was the kind of man the women in town whispered about over their mending, the kind of man whose name made shopkeepers straighten up as though expecting trouble, the kind of man who had a dark past wrapped around him so tightly you could see it in the set of his jaw every time he rode through Creston Falls to collect his monthly supplies in silence. She had lived 3 miles from that man for 8 months and spoken exactly 11 words to him. She counted it now, with her fingers around the folded shawl, the wool impossibly soft and warm. 11 words, most of them about her fence line. And now he had returned her shawl washed and folded like it was something sacred. She did not know whether to feel grateful or terrified. She did not know whether to feel seen or exposed, because if Monroe Walden had come down off that mountain in the dark and found her shawl on the fence post, he had to have known she had been weeping. He had to have understood that she had been broken open right there at the edge of her own property, and he had said nothing, done nothing except take the shawl and bring it back clean. That kind of silence, she would learn, was the most dangerous kind. It was the spring of 1879 when Della Winslow had first arrived in Creston Falls, a small settlement tucked into the foothills of the San Juan Mountains in southwestern Colorado, with nothing but a wagon, a trunk of practical clothes, and a husband who spoke more to his horse than to her. She had come from Wichita, Kansas, where her father had brokered the marriage to Roy Winslow the way a man brokers a land deal, with handshakes and figures and no conversation whatsoever with the woman whose life was being traded. Roy was 20 years her senior, a homesteader with 160 acres of deeded land and a reputation for being steady. He had been steady, steady as a stone. Steady as a stone can be when it never moves and never speaks, and never once reaches for the hand of the woman sleeping beside it in the dark. Della had been 22 years old on her wedding day. By the time Roy Winslow coughed his last breath in February of 1880, she was 23, and she had already grown so accustomed to loneliness that she could not tell any more where it ended and she began. The problem with being a widow in Creston Falls in 1880 was not the grief. The grief she could manage, the problem was the land. 160 acres of homestead claim required working, and working it required hands, and hands required money, and money required selling goods, and selling goods required getting into town, and getting into town required navigating every well-meaning man in Creston Falls who believed a widow needed a new husband more than she needed to be asked what she herself wanted. Sheriff Burl Tannen had begun riding out to check on her with a frequency that had nothing to do with law enforcement within 6 weeks of Roy's burial. The feed store owner, a man named Gerald Prout, had started extending her credit with a smile that made her feel like a debt she had not agreed to take on. Even the pastor of the little white church at the end of Main Street had begun mentioning in his prayers the virtue of a woman who accepted help gracefully. None of them had found her shawl and returned it washed and folded. She carried the shawl inside and set it on the table and stood there for a long time in the dim light of her one-room homestead, the fire burning low in the iron stove, and she thought about Monroe Walden in a way she had not allowed herself to think about him before. She knew the facts that Creston Falls had decided were the facts about him. He had come down out of the mountains 2 years ago, having lived alone up there for longer than anyone could pin down exactly. Some said 3 years, some said 5. There were rumors about why a man would retreat so completely from human society, and the rumors were the kind that attached themselves to a face like his, a face that had seen hard weather and harder things, a face that carried the evidence of a broken nose badly set and a scar along the jaw that could have come from a dozen different stories. The story Creston Falls had settled on was that Monroe Walden had killed a man. There were variations, a card game, a land dispute, a woman. There was always a woman in stories like that, as though violence needed a feminine origin to make sense to the people telling it. Della had never believed stories that needed a woman to be the cause of a man's ruin. She had seen enough of the world by 23 to understand that men ruined themselves through choices, and women were simply the nearest available explanation. She folded her hands on the table and looked at the shawl and made a decision that she knew was either the bravest thing she had ever done or the stupidest. She would go up the mountain and say thank you. She waited until the following morning, when the light was good, and the mud from the spring thaw had firmed up enough to make the path walkable. She dressed carefully, not for vanity but for practicality, a dark wool skirt and her good boots and her coat with the bone buttons that her mother had given her before she left Wichita. She wrapped the shawl around her shoulders because it was the right thing to do, and also because she wanted him to see she was wearing it, that she understood what he had done and was not pretending otherwise. The path up to Monroe Walden's cabin was not marked on any map, but Della had seen it from her property often enough that she knew the rough line of it through the pines. It took her 40 minutes of steady climbing before she smelled wood smoke and heard the sound of an axe splitting timber with a rhythm so unhurried and precise it sounded almost like breathing. She came around a stand of old-growth spruce and saw the cabin first, a solid, square-hewn structure of pine logs with a stone chimney and a covered porch. Not the rough lean-to she had imagined from the town's description of him, but something built by a man who knew what he was doing and intended to stay. There was a kitchen garden staked out along the south wall, bare now but showing the careful rows of last season. There were drying herbs hung under the porch eave. There was a water barrel collecting snowmelt from the roof. And there was Monroe Walden, standing at a splitting block 15 feet away, and he had already stopped swinging and was looking at her with an expression she could not read at all. He was taller than she had registered from a distance, dark-haired and broad-shouldered in a way that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with a life spent doing physical work. He was 31 years old. She knew that from a conversation she had overheard in the mercantile, though he looked older in the way mountain men did, weathered by altitude and solitude and whatever had happened before the mountain. He wore canvas trousers and a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow despite the morning cold, and he held the axe handle loosely at his side and watched her come across his clearing with an expression that was not hostile but was also not welcoming. It was careful. That was what it was. The look of a man who had learned to be careful. Della stopped at what felt like a respectful distance and lifted her chin, because whatever she was feeling in her stomach right now, fear or excitement or something she had no name for yet, she was not going to show it the way she had shown it at that fence post 3 nights ago. "You washed my shawl," she said. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he leaned the axe against the splitting block and said, It was on the fence. His voice was lower than she expected and quieter, the voice of a man who had spent years not having anyone to talk to and had not particularly mourned it. "I know it was on the fence," she said. "I left it there. I wasn't sure you'd find it, or that you'd know it was mine, or that you would." She stopped, because she was rambling and she did not ramble. She started again. "Thank you, it's a good shawl, my mother made it." Something shifted in his face. Barely anything, but it was there. "You didn't need to come all the way up," he said. "I thought I did," she said. "It seemed like the right thing." He looked at her for another long moment, and she had the uncomfortable sense that he was reading something in her face that she had not chosen to put there. She resisted the urge to look away. "You want coffee," he said finally. She had not expected that. She said yes before she finished thinking about whether she should. The inside of the cabin was as considered as the outside. One large room divided by function rather than walls. A sleeping area near the back with a pine-framed bed, and a thick buffalo robe for a coverlet. A working area with a woodworking bench along the south wall, and tools hung with the same care she had seen in the drying herbs outside. A cooking area near the stone fireplace with iron pots, and a cast-iron skillet and shelves of stored goods that represented serious planning: dried beans, cornmeal, salt pork wrapped in cloth, dried berries in clay jars. There was a bookshelf, and she noticed that before she noticed almost anything else, because she had not expected books. There were 7 of them, thick spines, well read. He poured coffee from a dented enamel pot into 2 mugs and handed her one without asking about sugar or cream because he had neither. She wrapped both hands around the mug and said, "I didn't know you had books." "Most people don't ask," he said. "What kind?" He looked at the shelf briefly. "Natural history, 1 on surveying, 2 on botany. There's a novel." "Which novel?" "Moby Dick," he said. "Read it 4 times." "Why 4 times?" "Still figuring out what it's about," he said, and she thought she saw the corner of his mouth move slightly upward, not quite a smile, but a gesture in that direction. She drank her coffee standing by the fireplace because he had not offered her a chair and she did not want to presume, and she looked around the room and understood something she had not understood before. This was not a man running from something in the way the town said. Or rather, it was not only that. This was a man who had built something. The cabin was not the dwelling of someone who had given up. It was the dwelling of someone who had started over. She set the mug on the mantel and said, "How did you know to leave it so clean? Most men would have just dropped it over the fence." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My mother had a shawl, different color, same kind of thing." "You don't drop something like that over a fence." It was the most personal thing he had said, and they both knew it, and the air in the cabin changed slightly with the weight of it. She picked up her mug again and took another sip of the bitter, strong coffee and said, very carefully, "I'm sorry for whatever it was that put you up on this mountain, Mr. Walden." He looked at her directly then, and she held the eye contact even though it cost her something. "I'm not sorry about it," he said. "Not anymore." She walked back down the mountain with the empty coffee mug, still warm in her memory, and her heart doing something she did not have the vocabulary for yet. The spring of 1880 in Creston Falls was a season of pressure in multiple directions, and Della Winslow was at the center of more of it than she liked. The homestead needed planting if she was going to eat through the next winter. She had learned enough from Roy's grudging instructions to know what needed to go in and when: potatoes and turnips first, then corn and beans when the ground warmed. But the breaking of new soil for expanding the garden was beyond what she could do alone with the hand tools she had. She needed a horse-drawn plow, which meant she needed to borrow one or pay to rent one, and both of those options required her to accept help from men who would interpret her acceptance as something she did not mean. Sheriff Burl Tannen solved that problem for her by riding out on the 2nd Thursday of April with his hat in his hands, and his intentions fully visible, and asking if she had considered that a woman alone on 160 acres was maybe more than one woman ought to be expected to manage. She had told him, politely but with complete clarity, that she was managing fine. He had ridden away with his hat back on his head, and the particular stiffness of a man who did not like being told no by someone who should have been grateful to be asked. She had watched him go and then turned back to the stubborn ground, and the hand trowel and understood, with a clarity that was almost peaceful, that she was going to have to find another way. The other way presented itself on a Friday morning, 4 days after her visit to the mountain cabin, in the form of Monroe Walden appearing at the edge of her property with a mule and a single-bottom plow. He did not announce himself. He did not knock or call out. He simply appeared at the edge of the south field where she had been trying to turn sod with a mattock, and when she looked up, blinking into the morning sun, he was already guiding the mule into position. "I'll do the breaking," he said. "You tell me where you want the rows." She stared at him. "I didn't ask you to come." "No," he agreed. "Then why are you here?" He was quiet for a moment, adjusting the harness on the mule with practiced hands, not looking at her. "Ground's going to be hard to turn in another 2 weeks when the dry sets in. Better to do it now." She stood with the mattock in her hands and looked at him. This closed, careful man who had come down off his mountain with a borrowed mule and a plow, and no explanation except the practical one. And she felt something move in her chest that she had learned, in the year of her marriage, not to trust. She had learned not to trust warmth because warmth had a way of meaning different things to men and women. But he was already working, and the furrows were opening behind the mule in clean, dark lines, and she was practical enough to know that the field needed breaking regardless of what she made of Monroe Walden's reasons. She showed him where she wanted the rows. They worked alongside each other through the morning without much conversation, and she noticed that he did not try to fill the silence with himself the way most men did. He did not offer his opinions about how she was doing things, or explain what he would do differently, or make observations about her situation that were really just invitations to depend on him. He broke the ground and she followed behind with the trowel, and when she looked up and found him watching her work, he did not look away with embarrassment. He just looked at her the way he looked at everything, with that careful, unhurried attention. At midday she went inside and came back with cornbread and salt pork and 2 cups of water from the well, and he sat on the fence rail and ate without ceremony, and she sat on the overturned crate she used as a porch step, and they ate in silence that was, she was startled to realize, comfortable. "The town says things about you," she said, when the silence had gone on long enough that she felt she could say something without it being an intrusion. He ate a bite of cornbread. "I know. I don't listen to what the town says," she said, "but I want you to know I'm not unaware that there are people who'd find it notable that you were here today." He looked at her steadily. "Are you asking me to stop?" "No," she said. "I'm telling you that if it makes trouble for you, I'll understand." "It won't make trouble for me," he said. "I don't live in town." "It might make trouble for me," she said honestly. He was quiet, considering this. "Do you want me to go?" She looked out at the broken field, the dark furrows that had taken her 3 weeks to do a quarter of with the mattock, and then she looked at him, this man with the careful eyes and the borrowed mule, and she said, "No. I don't want you to go." And that was the beginning of it. He came back 3 more days that week and finished the breaking. He came back the following week with a set of seeds for a kitchen garden variety she didn't have, a late-season turnip that kept better through winter than the kind she'd been growing, and he'd wrapped them in a piece of brown paper and left them on her fence post without a word. She planted them in the row nearest the house where she could watch them from the window. By May, she had started leaving a cup of coffee on the fence post on the mornings, when she knew he would be passing through on his way to collect supplies from town. By the 2nd week of May, he had started stopping to drink it, and then to talk, first about practical things, the weather, the soil, which season was coming in wet and which dry, and then about other things, smaller and more personal things, the kind that grow in the cracks of practical conversation. She learned that he had grown up in Missouri, the son of a carpenter and a schoolteacher, and that the schoolteacher had died when he was 12, and the carpenter had taken his grief out in ways that Monroe had not recovered from easily. She learned that he had worked a cattle drive at 19, tracked west through Kansas and into Colorado, and that somewhere between Missouri and here, there was a history that he spoke of in fragments, not hiding it exactly but not building it into a complete picture either, which made her understand that the picture, when complete, was probably painful. He learned that she had been given to Roy Winslow the way a piece of property changes hands, and that she had tried very hard to love Roy and had succeeded only in respecting him, and that she had cried when he died not because she would miss him, but because she had never stopped feeling sorry for him, a man who could not open himself enough to know that a woman like her was trying to reach him. He was quiet when she told him that. Then he said, "A man who can't see what he has doesn't deserve to be mourned." "That's not very kind," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's not kind, but it might be honest." The honesty was what undid her. Not the plowing, not the seeds, not the washed and folded shawl, though all of it mattered. It was the honesty. In a world of men who wanted things from her and dressed those wants in the language of concern and helpfulness and Christian charity, Monroe Walden said what he meant and waited to see what she would do with it. There was no performance in him. Whatever he was it without apology. She thought about this in June when Sheriff Burl Tannen rode out again, this time with Gerald Prout riding alongside him, and the two of them sat on her porch and told her that her deed situation was complicated, a phrase that made her stomach go cold because complicated in 1880 in Colorado territory was a word that meant someone wanted your land. It was indeed complicated. Roy Winslow's homestead claim had been filed under the Homestead Act of 1862 under his name alone, and because Roy had died intestate, meaning without a will, the question of whether Della could hold the claim as his widow was not as simple as it should have been. There was a competing claim, filed 6 weeks after Roy's death, from a man named Augustus Prout, Gerald's brother, who maintained that he had an older verbal agreement with Roy Winslow regarding the South 40 acres. Gerald Prout sat on her porch with his hat in his hands and explained this to her with the particular sympathy of a man who is very sorry about the trap he has personally set. Sheriff Tannen added that she might want to consider talking to someone who could help her navigate the situation, a legal man, which there were none of in Creston Falls, or alternatively a husband, which was what both of them were actually suggesting. She thanked them for their time and saw them off her property and went inside and sat at the table and looked at the wall for a long time. Then she put on her coat and walked up the mountain. Monroe was at his workbench when she got there, fitting the joint of a chair leg with the careful attention he gave to everything, and he looked up when she came in and knew immediately from her face that something had happened. She told him all of it, straight through, without softening any of it. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he set down the chair leg and was quiet for a moment, and she could see him working through the problem the way he worked through everything, methodically, without panic. "Do you have any papers?" he said. "Anything Roy signed, anything regarding the South 40? "Nothing that mentions Augustus Prout," she said. "Then they have nothing but a verbal claim," he said, "which in Colorado territory is not worth the air it was spoken into if the original deed is in your name as surviving spouse." "The deed is in Roy's name," she said, "not mine." He looked at her then and she could see him revising the problem. "You need a lawyer," he said, "not a husband, a lawyer." "There isn't one in Creston Falls." "There's one in Durango," he said, 40 miles. If you have the filing papers and the death certificate, a real lawyer can establish your inheritance claim. It's not simple, but it's not impossible either." She looked at him. "Do you know this, or are you guessing?" "I know it," he said. There was a pause. "From experience," she said. He met her eyes. "From experience," he said. And the way he said it told her that the experience had been painful and that he was not going to tell her more than that right now. And she accepted that with the same grace he had shown when she had told him things she was not ready to elaborate on. "I can't go to Durango alone," she said. "No," he said. "You probably shouldn't." Another pause. The fire in the cabin crackled. Outside, a wind moved through the pines with a sound like breathing. "Would you take me?" she said. I know it's a lot to ask. I'll pay for your time. Something moved across his face. Don't insult me, he said, but not harshly. He said it the way you say it when you mean the opposite, when you mean that you would do it for nothing, and the offer of payment is almost comic because of that. They went to Durango on a Monday, riding the 40 miles on horseback because the spring roads were still rough enough to make a wagon inadvisable. Monroe on his big gray horse, and Della on the small dark mare that had been Roy's only livestock she'd kept. She had the deed papers and the death certificate in a waterproof oilskin envelope tucked inside her coat against her chest. The ride took most of the day, and they talked for much of it, and she noticed that the conversation had changed since the winter. It had the quality of conversation between people who have stopped performing for each other, who have settled into something that has its own weight and warmth. She told him about the books she had read, and he had an opinion about every one of them, not always a conventional opinion, but always a considered one. He told her about the surveying work he had done in his 20s before the mountain, and she heard in his description of the land a love for it that went beyond occupation. You see it differently than most people do, she said, as they rode through a valley where the aspens were coming into leaf, the pale green of early spring trembling in the mountain air. The land, I mean, most men see it as something to be used. It's both, he said. But if you only see it as a thing to be used, eventually you run through it. He paused. Same as anything worth having. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Is that a philosophy or a warning?" He glanced at her sideways, and she saw something in his face that was not quite a smile and not quite vulnerability but lived somewhere between the two. "Maybe both," he said. They stayed overnight in Durango at separate establishments. Della at a boarding house run by a Mrs. Etta Carroll, a brisk woman who gave her a clean room and strong tea, and Monroe at a rooming house 2 streets away. They met the lawyer, a man named Douglas Fry, the next morning, and Fry looked over her papers and confirmed, after an hour of examination, that Della Winslow had a defensible claim to the full homestead as surviving spouse, that Augustus Prout's verbal claim was not legally actionable against a registered deed, and that he could file the necessary documents to establish her clear title for a fee of $12. $12 was almost everything she had. She paid it. Outside the lawyer's office, standing on the boardwalk in Durango's bustling Main Street, she breathed out for what felt like the first time in weeks. Monroe was standing beside her, watching her face. "Better," he said. "Better," she said. She turned and looked at him, this man who had come 40 miles with her on a Monday for no reason she had officially named. "Thank you, Monroe." It was the first time she had used his given name, and they both knew it. He was very still for a moment. Then he said, "Della," as though testing the weight of it, and it was the first time he had used her name either, and the weight of it was considerable. They ate supper together at a restaurant on Durango's Main Street before the ride back the following morning, a proper supper at a table with a lamp between them. And it was so obviously and uncomplicatedly a thing between two people who were drawn to each other that the waitress smiled at them in a knowing way that made Della's face go warm. Monroe noticed and did not comment on it, which made it worse in the best possible way. She asked him over the supper about the thing she had been waiting to ask about for months. "Will you tell me what happened before the mountain?" she said. "I'm not asking to pry. I'm asking because I want to understand you, and I think you're letting me, and I want to not assume." He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he might not answer. "I was a deputy," he said finally, "in a town called Garrett over the New Mexico border. I worked for a sheriff who was not what he appeared to be. He was taking money from a cattle operation that was running stolen stock. When I found out, I had a choice. I could look away, the way the rest of his deputies had chosen to look away, or I could do something about it." He stopped and picked up his coffee mug and held it. "I tried to do something about it," he said. "I sent a wire to the territorial marshal. The sheriff found out before the marshal arrived. There was a confrontation. A man died." He set down the mug. "It was the sheriff. I killed a man who was actively pointing a weapon at me, and it was within the law by every definition I know of, and I was cleared, and none of that mattered because the town had decided what the story was before the marshal ever got there, and the story was that I was the problem." He looked at her directly. "So I left. I came up the mountain and I built something that was mine, and I stayed there. Because whatever was in me that wanted to be part of something, to serve something, had been burned through, and I didn't trust it anymore." She held his gaze through all of it. When he finished, she said, "And now?" He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was so unguarded she felt as though she was seeing something he had kept from the world for years. "Now I'm less sure about staying," he said. She rode back the following morning with the legal papers secured against her chest, and the memory of that look stored somewhere she would not be able to stop returning to. The summer of 1880 in the San Juan foothills was the hottest in recent memory, and the work of a homestead in a Colorado summer was relentless. Della's garden came in strong. The late-season turnips Monroe had brought her flourishing alongside the beans and corn, and she found herself working from first light to last light with a satisfaction she had not expected. The land, which had seemed foreign and demanding all through the winter and spring, had become something she understood. She had come to know its moods, where the moisture pooled, where the frost came in late and left early, which slopes caught the afternoon sun and which stayed cold. She had begun to feel proprietary about it, in a way that had nothing to do with legal title, and everything to do with the intimacy of working the same ground day after day. Monroe came down from the mountain twice a week, sometimes more. He had begun helping with the heavier tasks without being asked, which she had initially resisted, and then accepted when she understood that he was not doing it from pity or from possession, but from something simpler and harder to name. He had begun sitting with her in the evening sometimes, on the porch step when the heat broke in the late afternoon, and they had conversations that ranged widely and came back often to the two of them. She had begun to trust him in the way you trust a structure that has been tested by weight and has held, not by faith alone, but by evidence. In July, she had told him about her childhood in Wichita in a way she had never told anyone, the years before her father had brokered the marriage, when she had wanted to be a teacher, when she had spent every hour she could at the small lending library on the edge of town reading everything they had, when she had believed, with the certainty of a girl who has not yet been told she is wrong, that she would have a life shaped by her own choices. He had listened to all of it without any of the deflective sympathy that most people offered when she spoke of her thwarted ambitions. Things work out for a reason, and God has a plan, and you've done so well regardless. He had just listened, and at the end he had said, "You could still be a teacher." She had laughed. "Out here, the settlement is growing," he said. "They'll need a school within the year. Who else would they ask?" She had thought about it for weeks after that conversation, this small, bright idea he had handed her, and she had held it carefully and not dismissed it. In August, Monroe Walden came down the mountain on a Wednesday morning and told her that he had received a visitor the previous evening. A man named Cole Prout, Augustus's eldest son, had ridden up to his cabin in the dark to deliver what he described as a friendly warning. The friendly warning was that the Prout family did not consider the matter of the South 40 acres resolved, and that making things difficult for an established family in Creston Falls was not something a solitary mountain man ought to make a habit of. Della looked at him across the fence post and felt the cold hand of fear on her neck again. "He threatened you," she said. "He tried," Monroe said, with the calm of a man who was not afraid of Cole Prout particularly, but was assessing the situation with clear eyes. "I want you to know about it because you should not be alone out here until this is settled." "I've been alone out here for 8 months," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to be afraid. I'm asking you to be careful." She looked at him. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to talk to Tannen," he said. "Not because I think Tannen is trustworthy, but because I think there are things I can say to him that will make this less convenient for the Prout family than they currently believe it is." "What things?" she said. He held her gaze. I know some things about how Augustus Prout acquired 3 of his ranching properties that he would not like discussed in public. Legal things, not accusations. Matters of record that a lawyer might find interesting. She stared at him. How long have you known that? Since winter, he said. Since before you came down and plowed my field. Yes, he said. She was quiet for a moment, working through the implications of this. Were you going to use that information regardless of whether it involved me? He considered the question honestly. Probably not, he said. It wasn't my business unless it became my business. And now it's your business, she said. Now it's my business, he said, and the way he said it was quiet and unambiguous, and she felt the ground shift slightly under her feet in the way it had been shifting, gradually and then all at once all summer. Monroe, she said. Yes, he said. Why is it your business? He looked at her for a long moment, and the morning light was coming through the pines on the east and falling across his face in the particular way of a Colorado summer morning, warm and clear. And he said, with the directness that was the thing she loved most about him, because you are. The word love had not been spoken between them, not yet, but it was there in everything that had accumulated over 6 months, in the washed shawl and the borrowed mule and the 40 miles to Durango and the evenings on the porch step and the conversation that had begun to feel, on both sides, like the truest thing either of them had. She stepped closer to the fence post. She reached out and put her hand over his where it rested on the top rail, and he looked down at her hand and then back up at her face, and neither of them moved for a long moment. Be careful with Tannen, she said. He's not what he appears either. I know, he said. I've known men like him. And the Prout family has friends in this town that we don't, she said. We need to be smart about this. He looked at her and the corner of his mouth moved in that way she had come to wait for. We, he said. She did not remove her hand from his. Yes, she said, we. Monroe Walden rode into Creston Falls on a Thursday morning and had a conversation with Sheriff Burl Tannen that lasted 20 minutes and resulted in Tannen going very quiet and pale in the way of a man who has been made to understand that the ground is not as solid beneath him as he thought. Monroe had been precise and careful, presenting the factual irregularities in Augustus Prout's property acquisition records as a private citizen concerned about the rule of law in his community, which gave Tannen no legal recourse but to hear him out, and gave Tannen every personal reason to make sure the Prout family understood that their current scheme was no longer worth pursuing. Whether it was Monroe's information, or the fact of the legal filing from Douglas Fry in Durango, or some combination of both, the competitive claim on Della's South 40 acres was quietly withdrawn the following week. Gerald Prout stopped extending her credit at the feed store with the particular warmth that had made her skin crawl, and started treating her as a straightforward customer, which was all she had ever wanted from him. Sheriff Tannen did not ride out to check on her again. She felt the lifting of it like a physical weight removed from her chest, and she stood in her garden on the morning. She received official confirmation from Douglas Fry and breathed out and looked at her land, all 160 acres of it, legally and solidly hers, and felt something she had not felt since before the marriage to Roy Winslow. She felt free. Monroe was there that afternoon when she received the letter, and she read it to him on the porch and he listened. And when she finished, he nodded once in a way that meant he understood the magnitude of it without needing to perform any reaction about it. Then she did something she had not planned to do. She leaned forward and pressed her lips to his cheek, briefly and completely, and then pulled back and looked at him and found him very still and something in his eyes that was not calm at all. Thank you, she said. He looked at her for a moment that stretched. Della, he said. Yes, she said. I need to tell you something, he said. She waited. I have spent 6 months coming down this mountain to be near you, he said. And I have been very careful about it because you had enough people making demands on your situation without one more, and I did not want to be one more. But I am finding it increasingly difficult to continue being careful in the same way, and I think you should know that. Her heart was doing something complex and wonderful. "I've known," she said carefully, "about the not being careful. I mean, I've known it was getting harder for you." "Have you known for yourself too?" he said. "Yes," she said, "for a while now." He reached out and took her hand, slowly and deliberately, the way he did everything, and she let him. And the evening light was moving through the pines and across the porch. And the land was hers and she was free. And she looked at this man who had returned her shawl, washed and folded and come down off his mountain and plowed her field and taken her to Durango and protected her from men who wanted what was hers. And she understood that she had been falling in love with him since the morning she had climbed that mountain with the coffee mug in her memory, and found him watching her cross his clearing with those careful, unhurried eyes. "I love you," she said. Because she was the one who had been practicing, all summer, learning to say the things she meant, and she was not going to let the moment ask her to be quiet. He looked at her face for a long moment, and then he lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, and she felt the warmth of it all the way to her collarbone, and he said, "I love you. I have loved you since you came up the mountain with your shawl on your shoulders and asked me why I washed it. Because no one had ever asked me why I did a thing like that. They always assumed, and you asked." She laughed, and it was the brightest sound she had made in 2 years. The autumn of 1880 was when Creston Falls began to understand that something was happening between the widow Winslow and the mountain man Walden, and the town's response to this understanding was divided, as it always is when people find something they cannot comfortably categorize. There were those who disapproved, who felt that a woman of good standing should not be conducting a courtship with a man whose history was unclear and whose social position was irregular. There were those who were merely curious, which manifested as watching, and there were those few Mrs. Etta Carroll who Della had stayed with in Durango and who had moved to Creston Falls the following season, and the McCready family who farmed the land east of Della's claim, who saw two people who had found each other in hard circumstances and were glad about it. Monroe came down the mountain more regularly, and did not hide that he was coming, and Della did not hide that she wanted him there. They ate supper together several evenings a week, at her table by the fire, and the conversation never ran dry, and the silence between words never became uncomfortable. She had begun to understand that what she had felt with Roy Winslow, the silence that had been absence, was nothing like this, the silence that was presence, the silence of two people who were so comfortable in each other's company that they did not need to fill every moment with sound. In October, she brought up the idea of a school. Monroe had mentioned it in July, and she had been carrying it since, and she raised it carefully at a meeting of the settlement's small community group, a gathering of homesteaders and merchants that met monthly at the church, and the response surprised her. Not everyone approved of the idea. There were those who thought educating children was a luxury, and those who were simply resistant to change. But there were enough who saw it clearly as a necessity. A growing settlement needed children who could read and write and cipher, that a vote was called, and the result was in her favor. Monroe was not at the meeting, because the dynamics of the town were such that his presence would have complicated things rather than helped, and he understood this practically. But when she came home and walked up the mountain to tell him, he was still awake by his fire, and he listened to her account with the pleasure of a man who had said this would happen and is glad to be right. "What will you need?" he said. "Books," she said, "and a building, and patience with families that aren't sure yet." "The building I can do," he said. "I know how to build." She looked at him across the firelight. "I know you do," she said. He began work on the school building in November, with the help of two of the McCready boys who he had made a practical agreement with, labor in exchange for Monroe repairing the McCready barn roof, which had been a problem since the previous winter. The building went up in 4 weeks, a solid structure with proper windows and a wood stove and a floor that did not leak cold, and the detail and quality of the work was of the kind that made people stop and look and revise their opinion of the man who had done it. Gerald Prout, whose oldest daughter was of school age, stopped Monroe on the street in December and said, not quite looking at him directly, that the building was well made. It was as close to an apology as the man was capable of, and Monroe accepted it with a nod that neither dismissed nor extended it. Sheriff Burl Tannen left Creston Falls in November, which was officially described as a retirement, but which the town understood was a departure of convenience following Monroe Walden's visit in August. A new sheriff was elected in December, a steady man named James Harker who had worked cattle in his younger years, and who had no particular interest in telling widows they needed husbands. He nodded respectfully to both Della and Monroe when he passed them on the street, which was exactly the right amount. Della opened the school in January of 1881 with 11 students ranging from 6 to 14 years of age, and she stood at the front of the room on the first morning, with the light coming through Monroe's well-placed windows, and felt the particular joy of being exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing. It had been a long road from the lending library in Wichita to this moment, and the road had gone through places she would not have chosen, but she stood in the morning light and was grateful for all of it, because it had brought her here to this room, to this land, to this life. Monroe proposed to her on a Saturday in February of 1881. He did it without ceremony in the way he did most things, which is to say with complete intention and no performance. He came to her door on a Saturday morning with nothing in his hands, which she noticed immediately because he always brought something, firewood or supplies or something from the garden he had been tending through the winter under glass and cloth covers. He came with empty hands and she looked at them and then at his face. "I want to marry you," he said. "I've been working out how to ask for 2 months, and I keep arriving at the fact that there's no way to do it that's better than just saying it. So I'm saying it. I want to marry you and live with you on this land and help you build the life you should have had, and I want to do it honestly and with your full choice in it. If you say no, I'll understand and I won't make it difficult." She looked at him for a long moment. The February morning was cold behind him, the mountain white with new snow above the tree line. "Monroe," she said. "Yes," he said. "Come inside," she said. "You're letting the cold in." He came inside and she shut the door and turned and looked at him in the warm light of the room, this man who had returned her shawl and plowed her field and taken her to Durango and built her a school and said "I love you" first by never once making her feel small. And she said, "Yes. Obviously yes. I have been waiting for you to ask for 2 months, and I was beginning to wonder if I was going to have to ask you." He laughed. She had heard him laugh before, but not like this, not this open and unguarded and fully present, and she thought it was the best sound she had ever heard in her life. They were married in April of 1881, at the little white church at the end of Creston Falls Main Street, on a morning when the aspens were just beginning to leaf out, and the sky was the particular blue that Colorado produces in spring that does not look real. It looks like a painting of what good things look like. Mrs. Etta Carroll stood up with Della, and Thomas McCready stood up with Monroe, and the 11 students from Della's school came in their Sunday clothes and sat in the front pew in a row and watched with the solemn attention children give to things they recognize as important. The pastor said the words, and Della and Monroe said the words back to him, and when Monroe slid the plain gold band onto her finger, his hands were steady, and his eyes were on her face, and she held his gaze all the way through it, because she wanted him to see, fully and without reservation, that she was here by choice, that this was the thing she would have chosen from the very beginning if choice had ever been offered to her. After the service, on the church steps in the mild April sun, he kissed her for the first time properly, not the cheek kiss she had given him in August, but a real kiss, his hands on either side of her face, and the assembled witnesses of Creston Falls, all 30-odd of them, made the various sounds that 30-odd people make when something they have been watching build finally arrives at its natural conclusion. Monroe moved down from the mountain. This was not a small thing for him, and Della understood it as the gift it was. He had built his life on that mountain around the specific conditions of solitude, the ability to be in control of his own company, the absence of the social machinery that had damaged him in Garrett, New Mexico. Coming down was a deliberate choice to return to a world that had not always been kind to him, and he made it with the same care he made everything, slowly, and with full understanding of what he was choosing. He kept the mountain cabin as a working space, going up 2 or 3 times a week to collect the herbs he dried and the timber he worked, because he had begun selling worked timber and furniture pieces, and the revenue from this added meaningfully to what the homestead produced, and also because the mountain was still his in some way he couldn't fully articulate, and she didn't ask him to. But he slept in her house and ate at her table and sat with her by the fire in the evenings, and after the years she had spent sleeping in the silence of Roy Winslow's refusal to be present. The presence of Monroe Walden was something she had to sit with in the mornings sometimes, simply to believe it was real. The homestead thrived in 1881. They expanded the garden and began keeping chickens, which Monroe built a coop for with the same unhurried precision he built everything. Della's school grew to 16 students by October, and she applied for and received a formal license from the Colorado Territorial Education Authority, which arrived in a thick envelope in November, and which she read 4 times before she put it in the tin box on the shelf where she kept the important papers. They were happy. It was not the happiness of people who have forgotten difficulty, but the happiness of people who know what the alternative is and have chosen each other anyway, and it had the specific density of things that have been earned. The first sign of the new life came in the spring of 1882, when Della put down the biscuit dough she was making one morning and stood at the kitchen table and counted backwards on her fingers very carefully and then sat down and held the edge of the table and breathed. She told Monroe that evening. He was at the table with the lantern, going over accounts, and she sat across from him and waited until he looked up. She said, "I think we're going to have a child." He went very still in the way that was his response to things of enormous importance, and she watched his face, and what she saw there was something she would carry for the rest of her life. It was not calculation or the particular male pride she had seen in other men's faces when the subject of children arose. It was something deeper and more careful, a joy that was also, around the edges, the fear of a man who knew how much it was possible to love something and how terribly that much love could be lost. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "I know," she said. "I'm a little frightened too." He turned his hand over and held hers and said, "I'm not frightened." He stopped and tried again. "I didn't think I would have this," he said. "I had decided I wouldn't, and now I'm revising everything I had decided, and it's a lot to revise." "Take your time," she said. He looked at her across the table in the lantern light. "Are you well?" he said. "Are you feeling well?" "I feel fine," she said. "A little tired, a little seasick, which seems strange at this altitude." He smiled, and it was the full, unguarded smile she had heard in his laugh the February morning he asked her to marry him, and she felt it all the way to the bone. The pregnancy was uncomplicated, which was a relief and a mercy. Della continued teaching through the summer and into the fall, her students eventually understanding what was happening in the way children understand things, all at once and without delicacy, and responding with the particular mixture of fascination and acceptance that children bring to the facts of life when they are not told to be embarrassed about them. Monroe was attentive in ways that were characteristically him, practical and consistent rather than fussing, making sure the wood was split and the water barrel was full, and the heavy lifting required nothing from her. He did these things without announcement and without requiring acknowledgement, and she acknowledged them anyway, because she was not going to make the mistake of letting things go unsaid that should be said. The child arrived on a cold morning in December of 1882, with Mrs. Carroll and a midwife from the settlement named Hattie Greer present, and Monroe in the outer room going through every piece of firewood he had split in a state of controlled anxiety that was, by Mrs. Carroll's report later, quite something to witness. The child was a boy, healthy and loud, and possessed from his first moments of his father's dark hair and his mother's particular sharp attention. Monroe came in when it was done and stood in the doorway and looked at Della in the bed and then at the bundle in her arms, and she watched the revision she had described to him in the spring complete itself in his face. "Come here," she said. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms and watched him hold his son for the first time. This careful man whose hands had built furniture and split timber and returned a shawl with such care, now holding something infinitely more fragile and more important with those same steady hands. "Hello," he said, very quietly to the baby. "I'm your father." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and did not apologize for it. They named him Henry, after Monroe's grandfather on his mother's side, the school teacher, because it seemed right to honor the line of teaching and the woman who had given Monroe his capacity for learning, even if that woman had not lived long enough to see what it built in him. Henry Walden was a robust, curious, thoroughly opinionated child from the first season of his life, which surprised nobody who knew either of his parents. He had Della's quickness and Monroe's stillness in rotation, silent 1 hour, and filling every available space with noise the next, and the house which had been quiet for so long adjusted to him as a house adjusts to a river, rerouting and settling and becoming something new around the life that has entered it. The school in Creston Falls continued to grow. By 1883 there were 22 students, and the original building Monroe had constructed was full. He expanded it in the spring, adding 2 more windows and a second room, working mornings before the students arrived, and then staying out of the way once the day began because he understood, with the precision that was native to him, that the school was Della's domain in the way the timber work was his, and that the best thing he could do for it was build what she needed and then let her be the teacher she was. She was an exceptional teacher. This was not sentiment but fact, observable in the way her students learned, and the way they spoke of her and the way parents who had been doubtful in the first year became advocates by the second. She had a gift for finding the specific angle at which a particular child could receive a particular thing, and she adjusted herself to the student rather than demanding the student adjust to her, which was unusual in 1883, and which produced results that were sometimes remarkable. There was a girl named Louisa Macready, the eldest Macready daughter, who had been told by everyone in her life that she was not clever, and Della spent 6 months finding the specific way Louisa learned, which was through pictures and patterns rather than through words and rote, and at the end of those 6 months, Louisa was reading at a level above her age and doing arithmetic that made her father's jaw drop. And the look on Louisa's face, the first time she solved a long division problem entirely on her own, was the kind of look that a teacher carries for decades. Monroe witnessed this moment and said afterward that he thought Della was going to save more lives than she knew, and she had looked at him and felt, in that moment, the specific quality of being loved by someone who sees you clearly. The years moved through them with the texture of a life fully lived. In the spring of 1885, a second child arrived, this one a girl, and they named her Clara after Della's mother, the woman who had made the cream-colored shawl that now lived in the cedar trunk at the foot of the bed, washed and folded and kept for good reason. Clara was from the beginning so different from Henry as to be almost comical. Where Henry was loud and active and perpetually in motion, Clara was quiet and watchful in the way her father was quiet and watchful, with eyes that seemed to be categorizing everything they landed on and filing it away in some interior library to be retrieved later. She was interested in the natural world in a way that delighted Monroe, who found in his daughter a companion for the mountain walks he had always taken alone, and who began teaching her the names of plants and the habits of animals with a patience and pleasure that Della watched from the porch and felt in her chest like something lit. Monroe Walden continued his timber work and furniture making through the 1880s, and his reputation for quality grew beyond Creston Falls. He was receiving orders from Durango by 1884, and from settlements even further by 1885, and the business it generated was consistent enough that they were no longer dependent on the homestead alone for their living, which meant the homestead could be tended with care rather than desperation. He hired 2 men from the settlement to help with the work, the McCready brothers' younger cousin and a quiet man named Eli Frank, who had come to the territory the previous year. And he ran the business with the same ethical directness he brought to everything, paying fair wages and keeping agreements and not making promises he didn't intend to keep. The Prout family, whose attempted land grab had been their introduction to the broader social reality of Creston Falls, eventually faded as a force in the settlement, as the Walden name gained the kind of respect that comes from consistent, visible integrity over time. Augustus Prout sold his ranching interests in 1886 and moved his family to Denver, and Gerald Prout shuttered the feed store the following year when a more fairly priced competitor opened on the eastern end of Main Street. These were not victories Della or Monroe celebrated with any particular sentiment. They were simply the natural consequences of how people's choices accumulate over time, and they moved on from them without dwelling. In the spring of 1886, Monroe brought Della up the mountain. He had not suggested it before, and she had not pushed, understanding that the mountain was something he held with particular care. But he came to her one Saturday morning in May and said, "I want to show you something." And she put on her coat and her good boots, the ones with the bone buttons from her mother, and climbed the familiar path with him, the one she had climbed alone 6 years ago with her heart in her throat and her shawl on her shoulders. The cabin was as she remembered it, solid and considered and full of intention, with the herbs under the porch eave and the kitchen garden along the south wall now showing 6 years of careful cultivation, richer and more diverse than before. He had planted fruit trees along the eastern edge that were beginning to produce. She could see where he had mended the roof and expanded the woodshed. But what he had brought her to see was past the cabin, along a path through the spruce she had not known before, to a clearing that opened onto a south-facing slope with a view that took the breath so cleanly from her lungs she had to stop and stand still for a moment. Below them, spread out in the morning light, was the valley, the settlement of Creston Falls with its grid of streets and the white church and the school building she could identify from here, the homestead with its fields and the south 40 acres and the line of the creek that ran along the eastern edge, and beyond all of it the mountains rising and rising in every direction, blue and white and impossibly large. "I've been looking at this for 8 years, Monroe said beside her. "I wanted you to see it." She stood and looked at it for a long time, the school building, her land. The life she had built in the place she had been sent to by a father who hadn't asked her, in a marriage she hadn't chosen, from which she had somehow, through loss and stubbornness and grief, and the particular grace of a man who returned a shawl washed and folded, arrived here. She turned and looked at Monroe, who was watching her face with his familiar careful attention. "It's beautiful," she said. "Yes," he said, not looking at the view, looking at her. She took his hand and held it, and they stood there for a long while in the May morning light, and she thought about the shawl in the cedar trunk at home, her mother's cream-colored wool that had been left on the fence in the dark and returned clean, and she understood now what that act had been. It had not been a simple task, a man washing a piece of fabric. It had been a man recognizing that something left in the dark and the cold was worth caring for. It had been the first honest statement of everything that followed. She leaned her head against his shoulder and his arm came around her, and the San Juan Mountains stood in every direction around them, indifferent and magnificent, and Creston Falls went about its small Saturday morning business far below, and none of it knew or cared about the two of them on the south-facing slope above the spruce line, holding on to each other in the spring sunlight. That was fine. This was theirs. The summer of 1887 brought a drought that tested everyone in the San Juans, the kind of season that revealed what homesteads were made of, because The easy margin the land gave in a good year disappeared completely, and what you were left with was the quality of your preparation. Della and Monroe's homestead came through it better than most, partly because Monroe had spent years observing the land's behavior through multiple seasons and had created water storage infrastructure that other homesteaders had not bothered with, and partly because Della had been diversifying the garden's plantings in ways that spread the risk. Drawing on information she had gathered from everything she had read, and from conversations with Monroe about what the land actually wanted versus what people assumed it wanted. They shared what they had with the families who struggled most, the Harker family and a newer homesteading family called the Rays who had come from New Mexico and were still learning the specific patterns of this particular piece of Colorado. Monroe spent 3 days in August helping Pablo Reyes reroute a creek diversion that had been improperly installed the previous spring, and Della brought food to the Reyes children when the family's stores ran low, and neither of them spoke of it as charity because it was not charity. It was the ordinary management of a community in difficulty, which is something entirely different. By September, the rains came back and the crisis passed, and the settlement gathered at the church for a service of thanksgiving that was also, in the way of settlements in a dry year, something of a raucous relief, and there was food shared on the church lawn afterward, and music from a fiddle player named Crenshaw who could be relied on for occasions, and Della danced with Monroe in the late afternoon sun on the packed dirt lawn of the First Church of Creston Falls, Colorado. And he was a better dancer than she had expected, moving with the same quiet precision he brought to everything. And she told him this, and he said he had learned at the harvest dances in Missouri when he was young. Before things had gone wrong, and she held him a little tighter for the next measure. Henry, at 5, had learned to dance from watching and was demonstrating this knowledge to Clara, at 2, with an instructor's confidence that was comical and touching in equal measure, and Della watched her children over Monroe's shoulder and felt the completeness of the moment with the specific gratitude of a woman who knows what the alternative was. By 1888, the school in Creston Falls had grown enough that a second teacher was needed, and Della facilitated the hiring of a young woman from Denver named Agnes Porter who had actual formal teacher training, and the two of them divided the students by age and approach in a way that worked very well. Della took the older children, 10 and above, and Agnes took the younger ones, and between them they produced a generation of children in Creston Falls who could read and write and reason, which was more than most of the region could claim. Monroe, watching the school expand and Della's increasing centrality to the settlement's social infrastructure, suggested the following year that she might want to speak to the Territorial Education Authority about the possibility of Creston Falls becoming an official school district, a step that would bring funding and resources that private subscription could not match. She had not thought of this, and when she thought of it, she understood immediately that it was correct, and she spent most of 1889 in correspondence with the authority and appearing before a small committee in Durango, the same Durango they had ridden to together 9 years before, and the official district designation was granted in October. She came home from Durango on the stage, which now made the run regularly enough to be reliable, and Monroe met her at the stage stop, and she told him on the walk home what had happened, the full story, the committee and the questions they had asked and the designation and what it meant, and he listened to all of it with the face of a man who is entirely pleased with the person he is walking next to. "You built that," he said. "You built the building," she said. "The building is easy," he said. "You built the institution." She bumped her shoulder against his arm as they walked, and he put his arm around her, and they came around the last bend of the path, and their home was there in the late afternoon light, solid and warm, with smoke coming from the chimney because Henry, at 7, had been old enough this year to learn to keep the fire, and he was apparently very committed to this responsibility, because the chimney was going at a rate that suggested he was warming the whole of the San Juan range. Clara came running from the garden where she had been doing something to a particular plant she had been observing all summer, and she ran to Monroe first, which was her habit, and he caught her up and carried her the last 50 yards to the door, and Della watched them and thought about a man who had decided he would not have this, and had revised everything he had decided. The 1890s came in with the particular energy of a new decade, Creston Falls growing steadily as the territory settled, and the railroad pushed closer, bringing with it both opportunity and the complicated social pressures that expansion always brought. There were new families arriving regularly, some fleeing difficult circumstances elsewhere, some simply drawn by the possibility the West still represented, and the school continued to be one of the settlement's anchor institutions. Monroe's furniture business had by now expanded beyond what the mountain workshop could sustain, and in 1891 he opened a proper workshop in Creston Falls itself, a stone-fronted building on the eastern end of Main Street with 2 large workshop windows and a front room where finished pieces could be displayed. The shop was modestly successful from the first and grew steadily through the decade, and Monroe ran it with 2 permanent employees and occasional seasonal workers, and was known for the quality of the work and the reliability of the agreements. Henry, at 9, was beginning to show an affinity for the woodworking that made Monroe quietly happy in a way he never fully articulated, but that was visible to Della in how he answered Henry's questions, with a patience and completeness that he reserved for things he loved. Clara, at 6, had decided she was going to be a naturalist, a word she had encountered in one of Monroe's books, and adopted as a professional title with the complete conviction of a child who has found their thing, and she was documenting the plants and insects of the homestead property in a notebook with a detail and consistency that her mother recognized as genuine. Della and Monroe talked about all of this in the evenings by the fire, the way they talked about everything, with the honest pleasure of 2 people who have each other to think with. She had come to understand over the years that the best thing about loving Monroe Walden was not any single act of care, not the shawl or the plowing or the trip to Durango or the school building or any of it, though all of it mattered, but the ongoing daily fact of him, his consistency and his honesty and his willingness to be fully present in the life they were building, without pretense and without hiding. He had told her once, in their 2nd year of marriage, that he had lived for a long time in the belief that what had happened to him in Garrett, New Mexico, was evidence of something broken in him specifically, some quality of character that caused things to go wrong when he tried to be part of something. She had listened to this carefully, and then said that she thought what it was evidence of was that he had encountered people who were afraid of integrity, because it made their own compromises visible, and that those people had tried to make his integrity into the problem rather than their own choices, and that there was nothing in him that was broken, only things that had been wrongly identified. He had been quiet for a long time after she said this. Then he had said, "I spent years on a mountain alone, and in all that time I couldn't come to that conclusion by myself." "That's what other people are for," she said. "Is it?" he said. "The right ones," she said. In 1893, Della became the official superintendent of the Creston Falls School District, a title and position that had never before been held by a woman in southwestern Colorado Territory, which was a fact the Denver papers reported on briefly when the appointment was made, and which the settlement of Creston Falls accepted with less controversy than might have been expected, because by 1893, Della Walden was not a stranger they needed to evaluate but a known quantity. A woman who had built something they relied on and trusted. Monroe read the Denver paper report at the breakfast table and looked up at her over it and said, "First in southwestern Colorado." "So they say," she said. "Not last," he said. "Definitely not last," she said. Henry, 11, asked what the newspaper said, and Monroe read it to him, and Henry received this information with the particular pride of a boy whose mother has done something significant, a pride that was, Della noticed, entirely unself-conscious and uncomplicated. Clara, 9, said she wanted to be first at something too, and Monroe said she was already first at knowing more about the native plants of the San Juan foothills than anyone else he'd met, and Clara accepted this with the dignity of a child who recognizes a fair assessment. The decade moved forward and the life deepened. The homestead's centennial acres were fully productive and well managed. The furniture shop was established enough to be a feature of Main Street. The school district was solid. And in 1895, there was another child, a surprise arrival in the late years of Della's fertility, a boy they named William after Monroe's Missouri grandfather on the carpenter side, because it seemed right to honor all of the people who had built what Monroe was from, not only the good things but the difficult ones, because all of it together had made him the man who came down the mountain. William arrived with his father's dark hair and an expression of extreme seriousness from his first hour of life that was so completely his father's face at its most thoughtful that Della laughed until she cried in the midwife's arms. Monroe held his third child with the same steadiness he had held the first, but there was something different in it now, the absence of the fear that had been around the edges of Henry's birth, the uncertainty of a man revising everything he had decided. This time there was only the joy, clear and uncomplicated, and the particular gratitude of a man who knows exactly how unlikely it was that he would be standing here at 46 years of age with his wife recovering in the bed and his son in his arms and his daughter asleep in the next room, and his eldest boy chopping firewood outside with the rhythm of someone who has learned from a careful teacher. William grew, and the family moved through the final years of the century with the texture of a life that was full but not overwhelmed, busy but not desperate, rich with everything that mattered and without much pretense about the things that didn't. The school district added a fourth teacher in 1897, and Della managed the whole of it with the same approach she had always brought to teaching, adjusting to what was actually there rather than insisting on what she had expected. Monroe's workshop reputation extended, by the late 1890s, to Denver, where a furniture dealer had been offering to represent his work for 3 years, and Monroe had finally agreed in 1898, which brought a level of business that required a third full-time worker at the shop. He took on an apprentice, a young man of 19 named Theo Reyes, Pablo Reyes' son from the New Mexico family they had helped through the drought of 1887, and the circle of that connection, the family they had helped when they needed it, producing a young man who now sat in Monroe's workshop learning the craft, was something that Della pointed out to Monroe one evening, and he received without comment, but with the particular stillness that meant he was holding it carefully. Henry at 17 was, as Monroe had half expected, committed to the woodworking, spending his afternoons and weekends at the shop with a seriousness of purpose that put him ahead of workers twice his age. There were conversations about whether he would go east for formal training in engineering or architecture, which would extend what he could do with the craft, and Monroe, who had never had that kind of opportunity himself, encouraged it without pressure. Clara at 15 had written a monograph, which was the word she used for it, on the medicinal plants of the San Juan foothills, a document of remarkable completeness and accuracy that the Denver paper, when Della sent them a copy with a note, published in a truncated form in their science column in the spring of 1898. Clara received this with the same measured satisfaction she brought to everything, and immediately began work on a second monograph on the root systems of high-altitude conifers. William at 3 was busy being 3, which in the Walden household meant he was following Clara around asking questions about every plant she examined, and Clara was answering him with patient detail that was both admirable and slightly terrifying in a 9-year-old, given how much she actually knew. The century turned on a clear night in Creston Falls, and the settlement gathered at the church for a midnight service that spilled out onto the lawn where someone had built a bonfire. And the fiddle player Crenshaw, who had been at every celebration for 20 years, played until his fingers told him to stop. Della stood with Monroe's arm around her shoulders under the January stars and watched Henry and his young friends celebrating with the energy of people for whom the future is an uncomplicated prospect. And she thought about a fence post on a dark night in 1880 and a cream-colored shawl and the cold hand of a winter she was not sure she was going to survive. She turned her face up to Monroe and he looked down at her in the firelight and she said, "Happy New Century." "Happy New Century," he said, and kissed her in the middle of Creston Falls' bonfire celebration, in front of their children and their neighbors and the whole of the life they had built, without any self-consciousness at all. She pulled back and looked at him, this man who was 51 years old and wore it in the way of someone who has been well used by the years, deeply lined and weathered and more fully himself than anyone she had ever known. "Do you remember the shawl?" she said. "I remember everything about the shawl," he said. "Tell me," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and around them the celebration continued, the fire and the fiddle and the voices of the people of Creston Falls moving into a new century. "I saw it from the tree line," he said. "I had been watching your property for weeks, not in a way I was proud of exactly, but in the way you watch something you don't know how to approach. And I saw you that night at the fence. I didn't come close enough to intrude, but I could see enough, the way you were standing. And when you went inside, I went to the fence, and there it was, your mother's shawl." He paused. "I knew it was wrong to take it without asking," he said, "but I couldn't leave it there in the night cold. So I took it and I washed it and I folded it and I brought it back. And then I sat up there on the mountain and spent 2 days talking myself into believing you hadn't noticed, and another week talking myself out of going down to your farm and making up a reason. And then I came to you," she said. "And then you came to me," he said. She leaned against him and he held her, and the fire crackled, and the fiddle played, and the stars above the San Juan Mountains were as clear and indifferent as they had always been. And under them the two of them were entirely unremarkable, just a woman and the man she loved, standing in the light of 100 years ending and 100 beginning, holding on to each other in the January cold. The years after the century's turning brought changes to Creston Falls as the West itself changed, the railroad making the settlement less isolated, the influx of new settlers changing the character of the town, the old frontier patterns giving way slowly to something that was neither frontier nor established civilization, but the particular in-between quality of a place becoming what it would eventually be. Della navigated these changes through the school district, which was the institution most directly affected by the new families arriving, and Monroe navigated them through the business, which had to accommodate both the regional character it had built its reputation on and the new commercial pressures. They talked about all of it in the evenings, sitting by the fire, Henry having left for Denver to apprentice at an architectural firm, Clara away at a women's college in the East studying botany with a ferocity that delighted her professors, William at 8 doing his best to be the only child in the house with the intensity that youngest children adopt when the others have gone. Monroe in 1902 made a chair. It was not a commissioned piece, and it was not for sale. He made it over 3 months in the mountain cabin, going up for the purpose, working the timber he had cut himself from a spruce he had known for 20 years, and the resulting piece was the finest thing he had ever made. A rocking chair with arms that curved exactly right and a back that was both strong and gentle, and he brought it down and put it on the porch of the homestead in the spring. He said nothing about it. She found it on a Saturday morning when she came out for her coffee, and she stopped and looked at it for a long time, and then she sat in it, and it was exactly right in the way that only things made for a specific person by someone who knows them completely can be exactly right. She rocked it twice and looked out at the land, at the garden and the fields and the south 40 acres and the tree line of the mountain, and she thought about all of it, the whole of the 22 years she had been building this life, and felt a peace that she had once been unable to imagine. Monroe came to the porch door and looked at her sitting in the chair. "Is it right?" he said. "It's perfect," she said. He nodded once, satisfied. He sat on the porch step below her, the way they had sat in the beginning, and they drank their coffee in the morning light, and the mountain stood above them, and the land stretched out in every direction around their home, and all of it was theirs, every acre and year of it, built from the ground up and from the dark nights up and from the cold nights at the fence post up. And it was good. It was so thoroughly and completely good. And she intended to sit in this chair for the rest of her life and be grateful for every single day of it. Henry came back from Denver in 1904 with a young woman named Rose and a proposal for building a house of his own on the northeast corner of the homestead property, where the land was level and the aspens provided shade, and Monroe and Della agreed without hesitation, because the land was large enough and Henry was theirs and Rose was thoughtful and good. Monroe and Henry built the house together that summer, father and son with the tools between them, and Della brought them their midday meal each day and watched them work side by side with a satisfaction that was beyond words. The house went up in 8 weeks, sound and well-made in the way of everything Monroe Walden had ever built, and Henry and Rose moved into it in the fall, and the following spring brought the homestead's first grandchild, a boy with Henry's eyes and Rose's coloring, whom they named James. Clara came home from the East in 1905 with her degree and a publication in a scientific journal, and a young man she had met in her final year, a fellow botanist named Arthur who was mild and clever and clearly entirely devoted to her. Monroe liked him immediately, which Della noted was the most important indicator, and Clara married Arthur in the same white church at the end of Creston Falls Main Street in the spring of 1906, with Henry standing up and Della in the front pew holding William's hand to keep him from fidgeting. William at 11 was showing the curiosity of both parents without yet having settled on a direction for it, which was entirely appropriate at 11, and Della taught him with the same attention she gave her school students, watching for the angle at which he would receive things, waiting for the thing to announce itself. In 1907, the creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property flooded in the spring thaw and took out the east fence entirely and damaged the near end of the barn, and Monroe, now 58, spent a week repairing it with Theo Reyes and one of the McCready grandchildren who had grown into a capable young man, and the work went well. But at the end of it, Monroe came in from the cold with a stiffness in his hands that was new, and that he mentioned only because Della asked him directly. She had him see the doctor in town, who told him what she had half feared, that the years of fine close work had produced an inflammation in the joints of his hands that was progressive and manageable but would need tending. The doctor prescribed warm soaks and a reduction in the heaviest work, and the kind of rest that a man like Monroe Walden had to be actively reminded to take. She made sure he rested. She was not gentle about it, but she was consistent, which was more useful. He accepted it with the same care he had always brought to the things she asked of him, and the hands were managed, and by summer the inflammation had reduced enough that he could work comfortably in the shop again with adjustments, and Theo Reyes was by now capable enough to take on the heavier cutting that Monroe had always done himself. In 1908, William at 13 announced that he wanted to be a doctor. He said it at the supper table one evening with the complete certainty of a child who has finally located his thing, and Monroe looked at him for a moment and said, "What kind?" "The helping kind," William said, and Monroe smiled in the full way that Della had learned to wait for. She told him later in bed that she thought William would be excellent at it. Monroe said he thought so too. Then he said, "He gets the helping from you." She turned her head to look at him in the dark. "He gets it from both of us," she said. He was quiet. Then he said, "I want you to know something." "What?" she said. Coming down that mountain, he said. Every day of it, every single ordinary day. I want you to know it's been the best thing in my life. She reached for his hand in the dark and found it. The fingers that were a little stiffer now than they had been. The hands that had returned her shawl and built her a school and held 3 children and made her a chair. I know, she said. I've always known. The years continued as years do, with their ordinary texture of work and seasons and the accumulated evidence of a life built properly. Henry and Rose had 2 more children, a girl named Me and then another boy named Thomas, and the northeast corner of the homestead property became a second household full of the particular noise and movement of young children. Clara and Arthur lived in Denver, where Arthur taught at the university, and visited in summers with the thoroughness of people who have left a place they love, and make up for it by returning completely when they do. William went to Denver for his schooling in 1914, following the path his father had encouraged Henry toward, and that Henry had completed differently. And he wrote home every week with the detail and precision of someone who had learned from 2 parents who believed that words mattered. Monroe Walden, at 71, was still the tallest man in any room he entered, still carried himself with the particular quality that Creston Falls had once mistaken for threat, and now recognized correctly as the stillness of a man who has fully become what he is. His hair was white, and the lines in his face were deep, and the hands moved more slowly at the workbench. But he was at the workbench most mornings, making smaller things now, boxes and frames and small furniture for Henry's children, working the wood with the patience of someone who has all the time he needs. Della, at 63, had stepped back from the daily superintendency of the school district, leaving it in the capable hands of Agnes Porter, who had been at Creston Falls since 1888 and knew every student and every family in the district. But she still taught a class on Friday mornings, because she was not ready to be entirely away from it, and the Friday class was the older students, 16 and 17, and she taught them rhetoric and composition, and the things that required a teacher who had genuinely lived. On a September morning in 1915, Della went to the cedar trunk at the foot of the bed and took out the cream-colored shawl. She shook it out and held it up to the morning light coming through the window. It was still good, the wool still fine, her mother's hand still present in the weaving of it. She put it around her shoulders and went out to the porch and sat in the rocking chair Monroe had made. The morning was still and golden, the aspens along the creek turning in the fall light, the garden past its summer fullness but still producing the late things, the turnips and squash. The mountain above the tree line was already showing the first snow of the season on its highest peaks, white against a sky so blue it was almost too much color for one morning. Monroe came to the porch with 2 cups of coffee and stopped when he saw her in the shawl. He looked at her for a moment in the way he still looked at her, carefully and completely, the way he had looked at her crossing his clearing 35 years ago. She held out her hand for the coffee. He came and sat beside her, not on the porch step now, because the porch step was 35 years ago and they were not those people anymore. They were these people, the ones who had come through everything and arrived here, and he sat in the chair beside her and gave her the coffee, and she wrapped both hands around the mug and they looked out at the land together. "The shawl," he said. "I thought I'd wear it," she said. "It's a good shawl." "It is," he said. She looked at him. "Thank you," she said, "for washing it." He looked back at her with the slight movement at the corner of his mouth that was still, after 35 years, the thing she waited for. "Thank you for climbing the mountain," he said. She reached out and took his hand, the careful hand with its stiffness and its history, and held it in the September morning, and the land was hers and his and theirs, all 160 acres of it, and the mountain stood above them as it always had, and the aspens turned, and the 2 of them sat in the morning light and were entirely, thoroughly, irreducibly at home. William became a doctor, as he had promised at 13 he would, and returned to Creston Falls in 1922 to practice, which was more than his parents had dared to expect, and he brought with him a wife named Josephine, and within 2 years a grandchild named Monroe James Walden, who arrived on a Thursday in October and was received by his namesake grandfather with the same stillness and the same complete joy as every other thing of importance. The years that followed were gentle years, the years of grandchildren and long evenings, and the deep comfort of a life that has given everything it had and received everything it needed. Henry's family and William's family and the visits from Clara and Arthur filled the homestead with the noise of generations, and Monroe and Della moved through it all with the particular grace of people who have earned their peace and know it. Monroe Walden, in his 78th year, was still going up the mountain. He went more slowly, and he went with William's quiet approval and a walking stick he had made himself from a branch of the old spruce, but he went. The cabin was still standing, maintained now by Henry, who had taken to the mountain with some of his father's feeling for it, and Monroe went up 3 or 4 times a year and sat in the clearing with the view of the valley spread below, and let himself simply be in the place that had saved his life before the woman at the fence post had saved it again in a completely different way. He came back from one such visit on a bright afternoon in October and found Della on the porch in her rocking chair with the cream shawl around her shoulders, reading, which was a sight so completely and perpetually right that he stood at the bottom of the porch steps for a moment and simply looked at her. She looked up from the book. "How was the mountain?" she said. "Good," he said. "The aspens are turning." "I can see them from here," she said. He came up the steps and sat in his chair beside her, and she went back to her book, and he looked out at the valley and the aspens and the mountain above the tree line and thought, as he thought often and had never fully grown accustomed to, that this was what he had almost missed. The shawl on the fence in the dark, the sound of a woman crying in the night air, and a choice, his choice, to take something left in the cold and bring it back warm and clean, and the 38 years that had followed from that single act of unnamed care. The land was gold and green in the October light. The grandchildren were somewhere beyond the creek, William's daughter's voice carrying back in the way children's voices carry in autumn air. The smell of supper was coming through the open door behind them, Josephine and Rose cooking together with the particular domestic symphony of 2 women who have shared a kitchen for years. Della turned a page. Monroe reached out and put his hand on her arm, just briefly, just the weight of it, and she made a small sound of acknowledgement without looking up. And that was all that was needed, that was the whole of it, and neither of them would have changed a single thing. The shawl was on her shoulders, and the mountain was above them, and the land was theirs, and everything had been said that needed saying. And the rest, the beautiful, ordinary, extraordinary rest, was simply the living of it, day by day and season by season, for as long as they had, which was more than enough and exactly sufficient, and the most complete thing either of them could have imagined on the far side of a fence post in the dark of a Colorado winter, which was the beginning of everything, which was where all of it had started, with a shawl returned washed and folded, and the first honest act of love.